when we start debating more like people than ideas, so if someone says, I have this much experience, or why don't you trust me, or anything like that,
Yeah.
when we're debating or reversing a decision or anything like that, that is really more about the person than the work. And I don't, I almost never want to comment about the person, like really ever. I only want to talk about the work. I only want to talk about the ideas. But often, if we've worked really hard on something, it can feel like we're being personally attacked or personally reproached when the idea is reversed or undone or debated or we're asked to defend it. So, um, cultivating that detachment from it is just, I think, a lifelong process.
We're just over 50 people now. We've been fully remote from day one. Most of the questions are related to scaling remote teams. And I know you guys are really some of the OGs of remote work. I'm curious to learn, uh, to see around some of the corners and see if there are any sort of any solutions that you figured out that could address some of the problems that we have right now.
I will say it's a historical document, so not currently accurate.
Mhm.
But there was an author named Scott Berkern who joined Automatic when we were around 45 or 50 people.
Hmm.
Wrote a book about his next 1 or 2 years.
Oh, no kidding. I got to check that out.
Um, it's called The Year Without Pants. And it's, some of the stuff is not as relevant now. Like we were definitely a little more of a culture that like hung out and drank a lot
Yeah.
and did and that sort of thing. Like a little more, I would even call it bro forward back then.
Hmm.
Which isn't us now, but just for like a point in time when we were in literally an identical spot that you're in.
Totally. This is more of a tactical question. So we have found that uh, the concepts of remote and async are pretty strongly intertwined. My exposure to other companies that try going remote but don't also embrace async, it ends up being just a lot worse,
Yeah.
where you just spend a lot of time. I think you mentioned this on a podcast that I listened to, of like kind of get the worst of both worlds, and this hybrid intermediate step is pretty brutal. How async is automatic?
As async as possible and no more.
Okay.
So I think that synchronous is really beautiful. So when I say that we try to be as async as possible, I don't mean to downplay any of the incredible value of like what we're doing right now.
Right.
Because if this were, I think of a lot around network architecture, like if our ping times to each
Hmm.
other, like if I send you a send or an ACK and that took, 5 minutes to come back, that would slow the rate at which we can iterate on our ideas together in this conversation. So, but let's make sure that we focus that sync time to create something that's really valuable, like this conversation, or that we both have the information that we want beforehand so that our conversation isn't just catching up, it's more like the debate or discussion. Um, for something like this, it's actually good because the information you want is essentially my life I have lived. And your questions are all the life you have lived. So we're both like fully caught up. But let's say this was about like some aspect of our product and you knew it really well and I didn't. It wouldn't be as a productive of a conversation if it was, this widget over here and I didn't really know that widget that well. So I think getting everyone to the same sort of baseline understanding sounds simple, but is actually really, really hard. And it's worth checking in. Like, hey, I heard you say XYZ. That means Z or whatever. And then going back and using that sync time for when it's most useful. And then asynchronous, the other nice thing about asynchronous is that it is usually recorded. Like asynchronous is
Yeah.
usually around forever. So
Right.
for us, that's P2, WordPress.com/P2, which is our internal blogging system, which is like our internal blockchain, almost like a blog chain, you could call it, where like every
Mm-hmm.
post and comment is the um, organizational blockchain of every decision that's been made in the company, you know, including like offhand ones and really long essays and treatises. And they're all permalinked, they're all addressable, they're all composable, if you will, from a programming point of view, which is really, really useful, especially when you're trying to figure out why something happened a certain way years later. Which, if you're successful, you will be. There'll be a bunch of
Right.
new people who weren't there, and they'll be like, "Hey, why is this door red?" Because nothing else in this room is red, and you're gonna have to like be. It's nice to have an indexed record of how that conversation happened and why that decision was arrived at.
Yeah, that actually neatly ties into two of the other topics that I wanted to cover. One is around context collapse and information filtering, and the other is around communication mediums.
Hmm.
Um, the I'll start with the context collapse problem, where I think we started to really feel this around maybe 40 employees. That was the time when it was no longer possible for everyone to know what everyone else was doing. And you could just spend all day, every day, just reading up on what other people were doing at the company and not doing any work. And it started to get really stressful for people. And we had a good conversation with Darren Murph from GitLab, who he reframed it as, do people ever complain about there being too much information on the internet? And the answer is no. That means you don't have a volume of content problem. You have an information filtering problem. And that was a helpful reframing. But we still haven't solved that problem.
I love that reframing, by the way. Go Darren.
Yeah, so I'm curious, as you're on a much larger scale than we are. So I'm sure you've come up with some mechanisms and systems. So understanding um, how how do how do you figure out what information should be available to each person, pushed to each person, discoverable by what teams? When somebody writes a 5,000 word memo, how do you ensure that the people who need that information get it effectively in a synthesized way? Um, we're just starting to bump up against this problem, and I imagine it's only going to get. I think it actually gets polynomially worse as we add more people.
Yeah, blessed be the curators, right?
Yeah,
So I think that it becomes really important. The greatest gift you can give to your colleagues is great summaries, and we have a few people in our organization that do just for fun. Like they read a ton of stuff and then they make like a little weekly newsletter or
yeah,
like, collect their links. So things that people do on the internet, you can do within your company. And if someone has a predilection to that, that is both an incredibly helpful and incredibly powerful position in the company to be the one that reads a ton of stuff and then like distills it down and saves everyone else a ton of time. Because now, in terms of accessibility, I like for it all to be fully accessible. So if I want to go read that 5,000 word thing, I should be able to click on it and get to it. So in terms of
right,
access control, I tend to err on the side of within the company every link always works.
right.
Uh, but I've definitely clicked on those and loaded them, and sometimes see like a long post with like 100 comments on it. I'm like, ooh.
Yeah,
uh, uh, so we have two um, sort of what's the word abbreviations that we use a lot in automatic. TLDR, which is very common, too long, didn't read. So that's a nice thing to put at the top. So we do that as like a convenience, or sometimes we'll summarize a thread and pin a comment to the top of P2 that says like this was kind of like where this all ended up. Sometimes I'll ask people to reply to something at the very end because often scrolling to the bottom is good to see like what the latest thing is, and just say, "Hey, we ended up XYZ," or "Here's the latest version of this." Just so there's always a path to the latest information or the best information. I call this yellow arrows, inspired by the Camino de Santiago, which is a pilgrimage trail. Couple hundred miles, I think. There's a lot of different ways you could take, but like it's going through cities and countrysides and everything. So there's like lots of wrong turns you can take. And so just over the years, people painted these yellow arrows on trees and walls and everything. And sometimes you'll turn someplace and the yellow arrow will point the other way. And so
Mhm.
there's not like a committee that painted all these. It's literally
Yeah,
been, hundreds of people walking and hundreds of people taking wrong turns. And so if you ever take a wrong turn, you can leave your little yellow arrow, which is usually a link to the place where you found out you were looking for. And
right,
that's what I love about hypertext versus like it's not like you can put a copy of your keys every place you look for your keys, you know?
right.
But online, if you look 5 different places to find this like particular metric, like you can link it from all those places pretty easily. And
Yeah.
I try to, remind people like if it's just text, like let's update it frequently and make it very easy to update.
Yeah, I think redundancy in text in digital medium is something that is underappreciated. There's no cost to adding a link, and so it's really easy to keep things redundant, and just linking things together adds a ton of value. We were talking about context collapse and information filtering, and
Mm,
the the synthesizer or curator role. Is that there are companies like I know Amazon, uh, they have many more internal comms people than you
mm,
see at other similar technology companies.
hmm.
Um, and I I think part of the reason for that is their culture around externalizability in AWS. So my guess is that their internal comms people sort of also function as marketing people to some degree, because they are effectively, when you write a PR FAQ, it's kind of the same thing as your marketing function. Um, but I wonder, have you ever formalized this role of curator, or has it just been something that happens organically?
We do have various reportings that bubble up. So they naturally kind of feed into each other, almost like tributaries of information that feed into a larger river. And you can just watch the river and get a lot of the gist of it. So some things that are regular cadences for us is that we ask pretty much every team to do a every other week update. Um, Oh, actually, sorry, weekly, Thursday. We call them Thursday updates because we used to do them all on
Mhm.
Thursdays, but then we naturally spread them out throughout the week because
Sure.
Thursday was a little intense. So some do them on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but they still historically called Thursday updates.
Hmm.
And this is meant to be a summary of your group's work that's relevant for the rest and jargon free and understandable for the rest of the company. So someone who's not working on everything every day, can they see what you did? Our design group has been leading something they call snaps, which are basically visual versions of this. So showing like a before and after, which is also really great. Um, these also bubble up to like monthly investor updates, which we share with the whole company. Do it for the external, do it for the internal. We also share our board meetings and other sort of external communications to stakeholders with everyone internally. And that process, the nice thing, if you do it right, it's not always perfect, but if you do it right, these things, the small things, make the big things easier. So like the summaries get easier and easier because you can look at the summary of the summary essentially and say, okay, of these 30 things, here's the 10 that were most interesting.
Yeah, and one of the other topics related to the kind of culture of transparency and communication, I I've been thinking a lot about how different media affects the way that people perceive information.
Hmm.
Um, I had a really good podcast with David Perel, who's the
Love it.
writing guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he thinks a lot about writing. And I also had a conversation with Vinay from Loom, who thinks a lot about video as a medium. We've been doing a lot of experimentation with writing versus video versus all these different mechanisms for communicating in an asynchronous way, and we find ourselves increasingly gravitating to video for
Mm.
things like updates and the TLDRs and certain types of communication. And there's a certain degree of interpersonal. I really think it's something lizard brained about seeing a human face and
Yeah.
somebody's tone that really goes a long way towards uh, these building that trust and confidence in other people. So your company's been around for a long time, since before a lot of these video tools were common. I'm curious how, if at all, you've embraced some of these tools, and if that's something that you've thought much about.
This is an area where I'll say that we're also evolving. I would say that we are very text heavy. Oh, and to an earlier point, um, writing ability, it's hard to screen for reading ability, but you can screen for writing ability quite easily.
Sure.
And that is a fantastic thing to screen for in hiring. There's almost no downside um, to looking for good writers in your hiring process. We are starting to use Loom and short videos, and in fact, this has led me to push our internal video product to have like uh, captioning and easy speed up and stuff like that. Um, it's I 100% agree with you. The only downside I personally experience is that if I'm like trying to catch up on things on my phone, I'm not in line. If you don't have that audio, if you don't have the AirPods, it's not as accessible.
Yeah.
But other than that, and maybe with auto captioning that'll all go away. But it
Hmm.
does feel like one of those things where as long as you can speed it up, I think it's fine.
Yeah.
Because it is true that I think we can consume information faster than you or I naturally talk as humans.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's actually, I've seen data on this that I think where typical audiobook and speed at which the average person reads, when that converges, is around somewhere between 3 and 3.5x
Hmm.
speed of watching a video, which is much faster than most people can input information.
If you want your mind blown, there's also people who are blind, apparently parts of their brain gets reassigned to the audio processing, and they can understand sped up audio at things that are totally illegible to you or I, uh,
Yeah.
at like 20 or 26 syllables per second.
Hmm.
And I'll send you a link to this. You can share with the team later. It's
Yeah.
just kind
Yeah.
of cool to listen to because it sounds it's you can read the text that they're speaking and
Uh-huh.
then you hear it and you're like, wow. But people can actually totally understand that, which is
Sure.
probably what like if we played a 3x podcast to our grandparents, they'd be like, how are you? Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like training. Like
Yeah.
the brain is incredibly malleable and can do amazing things.
Yeah. Definitely. I have another tactical question um, of managing organizational complexity, specifically related to decision making. Um, this is something a lot of founders that I've talked to who reach this scale of around 50 people, decision making processes start to break. Um, in the, call it, pre-25 people stage, the decision making process was basically people come to me as the CEO with an idea, and then I decide whether we do it. And then that's the whole process. And we are now at a point where I am no longer the person who has the most context on making decisions. And so we need to push that decision making up the tree to more of the edges so that people with the most context can make the best decisions. And so I'm curious on like a very tactical level. I think philosophically, I've read a lot about how you think about decision making as an organization, where you want it to be as
Itch.
close to the edge as possible, and we're
Mm.
very much aligned with that. So I'm this is less of a philosophical question and more of like a practical question. If a PM on the team has an idea for a thing, what happens next, and how do these decisions get made? How do conflicts get resolved, and how do resourcing trade-offs get handled?
Yeah, I think the important thing there is to break down the word decision into different types of decisions. And particularly, I like to talk about reversible versus irreversible decisions.
Right,
And in the realm of irreversible decisions, taking an investor, and the truth is it's a continuum. Like if you took the wrong investor, you could buy them out. It's just that's a hard thing to do, you know, versus we can all think of easily reversible decisions, like many things in technology, like changing the
right,
color of things or a multivariant test. So along that continuum, you want to, I think, have speed. And I think where organizations fail is where they make reversible decisions slowly. So,
right.
uh, or where they make reversible decisions without a feedback loop. So, if you imagine yourself making these reversible decisions quickly and with some sort of feedback loop, um, you're in the best possible place for getting to the right answer. The hardest thing about this, I would say, is reminding yourself of it, and two, identity. So it's, and I still struggle with this today, especially in the open source side of things, is that when we start debating more like people than ideas, so if someone says, I have this much experience, or why don't you trust me, or anything like that,
Yeah,
when we're debating or reversing a decision or anything like that, that is really more about the person than the work. And I don't, I almost never want to comment about the person, like really ever. I only
hmm,
want to talk about the work. I only want to talk about the ideas. But often, if we've worked really hard on something, it can feel like we're being personally attacked or personally reproached when the idea is reversed or undone or debated or we're asked to defend it. So, um, cultivating that detachment from it is just, I think, a lifelong process. And by the way, I make that same mistake too.
it's
Where I'll come and be like, just do it because I'm the CEO, you know. And
uh-huh,
it still happens. Still, 17 years later. So
uh-huh,
it's not perfect, but just keep that in mind. And if you ever find a discussion is going off, it's a good question to ask. Like, oh, did this switch from being about the idea to maybe being about ourselves? And if so, how can we reverse that and say, like, hey, we're all in this together. We all work together. We're all get the paycheck from the same place. We're all on the same team. Let's just figure out the best thing for our customers or users or process or efficiency or whatever.
yeah. One of the problems we're doing better at it now, but I don't think we solved this is uh, we we have had situations where we had agreement on whatever the decision was in terms of like, yes, we should do a thing. And I'm thinking of one project in particular that went off the rails because we gave the person the thumbs up to do the project, but we didn't resource the project explicitly. And so this person had this mandate and this expected outcome, but not the resources to deliver on it. And it just
Mm.
created incredible frustration and conflict between them and other business units. So how do you, when it comes to that kind of decision making, I imagine, do we want to do the thing is something you have to decide. What are the resources needed to do it? And are we allocating them? Are there any other things that like we really need to take into consideration to make sure these things are done successfully?
I'm sure we have also made that mistake hundreds of times, literally. So don't beat yourself up about it. It's probably going to happen regardless.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that's just a function of communication. So if you're saying yes to this, this means X, Y, Z. I personally avoid the term resourcing because or resources um, because I feel like that level of abstraction sometimes allows us to not really think about what's needed. Um, is it resources or is it two people working mostly full time for 2 weeks? Or like
Yeah.
kind of get nitty gritty about it and like really describe what is going to be needed. And then it just the more sometimes even just like describing it like to a 5-year-old, like really being descriptive on the process, the people, the time, the sign-offs, whatever it is, can feel silly, but is remarkably helpful because even at the most senior levels or people with decades of experience, you'd be surprised how many times everyone around the table is nodding because they think they agree, but they all have a slightly different version of what they're agreeing to in their head, and that might not be apparent, especially if you know, you sign off and then you check in like a month later, you find out the month later that like
Yeah,
the thing that was built was not what we thought we all agreed to. And that still happens with us too. And I see why that's frustrating. It's frustrating for me, like as maybe the person who agreed to something that's not what is built. I bet it's also frustrating to that person who built it because like
definitely.
could have done that too if you just like had a clear understanding. Um, so almost every organizational issue is some subset of a communication issue.
Yeah, I've seen really good engineers quit companies when they work on a thing for 3 months and then find out afterwards that it was different than what needed to be built. And
Mm,
like nobody wants to burn 3 months of their lives on something that doesn't get implemented. It's not a fun position to be in.
agree.
Yeah,
Unless, well, that's different types of mistakes. So if you burn 3 months and then you learned that that is a bad path to go down, that's great.
for sure.
But if you burn 3 months and then you learned that that wasn't what was intended in the first place,
Yeah,
that hurts,
yeah, it
you know?
does.
So it's yeah, you want to I think the former you want more of even,
Right.
because
Sure.
you're closing off paths of inquiry, but the latter as few as possible.
Yeah. The next big push that we have really this month in August is we've come to this recognition that we need to be more, we need to take performance management more seriously.
Mhm.
Um, and it really is in both directions. The thing that surprised me about this was how I have always heard of performance management from like the top down management side of things, but the people who have been requesting this are actually the employees, like are
Mm,
like on the ground engineers. They want to know how they're doing. And
yeah.
in a lot of the one-on-ones I've done with people on the team, the problems that we need to solve are things like people want to know, are they performing? Are they advancing? Are they at risk of being fired? People want to know that.
Yeah.
And I think that's reasonable.
Especially right now.
Yeah, for sure. And uh, I think it's also, there's a degree to which it is our responsibility uh, as leaders to set people up for success in their careers, in their career growth, and help them reach their goals. So I have other questions around performance management, but how I it seems like
Yeah.
almost everybody has their own approach to it. I just like at a high level, how do you approach this topic?
It's so huge because it's basically performance is the entirety of the job.
Right.
I'll tell you things that we avoid. I don't like the whole company evaluating things at the same time, or even whole teams. So what we try to do is spread it out throughout the year. Kind of like I said, we used to do all our Thursday updates on Thursdays, and that was too much, and we
Yeah.
spread it out. It's kind of like what how we've designed our internal HR systems is that there's not like a evaluation week or anything like that, but everyone is getting asked about one of their colleagues in some 360, like a colleague, a manager, a subordinate, periodically throughout the year on a rolling basis. So let's say Sam, you're a manager in the middle somewhere. Hopefully, I'm getting some feedback on you, like maybe like every 1 to 3 weeks from someone you work with. And so let's say you work with 10 people regularly, they might be asked, you know, uh, 3 to 4 times per year, how's Sam doing? And maybe a specific question each time, like how is Sam's communication style? Or how is Sam, uh, you know, we had the questions. I don't want to ad lib them because we
Sure,
have
sure.
the ones we've thought of and that try to be sometimes they tie to our creed, which is at automatic.com/creed, which is kind of like
Mm,
our values thing. Um, and that I find that really helpful as well because it also helps you catch faster if someone's struggling. That can happen for a variety of reasons, some of which the company can help with and some of which it can't. But you want to be aware of anyway. And the company can help maybe by removing some responsibilities if someone's going through a difficult personal situation or health situation or something. Like, you know what? If someone you love is facing a existential health crisis, guess what? You're not going to be productive. We all know that. I mean, you could try to. By the way, you're going to try to, but it's not going to be there. So let's just be aware of that. And let's make sure that that is an open communication. You don't have to share even what it is
mm.
if you're not comfortable with that. Maybe with HR, but you don't have to share it with everyone if you don't want everyone asking you about it or something. But just so that there's a knowledge that um, that's possible. As an aside, something we actually ended up with there as well is a way for people to move to partial time employment for partial pay. So
Interesting.
we did some experiments in the company on like 4-day work weeks and other things.
Yeah.
Honestly, that we didn't stick with it.
All
I
right.
think it's there. There's obviously a diminishing margin of return to work,
Sure.
and sometimes more work means more stuff gets done.
Yeah.
It's not like a perfect 40-hour thing. Um,
Yeah. I actually think most of the data indicates the opposite of that, diminishing marginal return. I think it's most of the evidence that I've seen shows an increased marginal rate of return after some number of hours. Like people
hmm,
people who work 10% more hours, difference between 40 and 44 hours per week, make about 30% more in terms of compensation. I think this is maybe too in the weeds on this topic, but I think there's a dead weight loss of communication that might be 20 or 30 hours a week.
hmm,
And so any time above that dead weight loss is actually very highly leveraged. And so I think it's actually the
hmm.
opposite.
I will also posit that a really effective asynchronous distributed organization maybe has a smaller dead weight.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
Um, I have observed it even with myself. I'm 38 now. I've gotten COVID twice. Like, I definitely feel it sometimes where I just feel a little bit slower towards the end of the day. Where before, like, I might be able to do like really great, nighttime coding sessions. So for myself, I've seen aligning my task with my energy levels is really important throughout the course of the day. In the morning, I'm really great at reading and understanding, especially long things. And towards the end of the day, I find that I can still read the long things, but I retain a lot less of it. And so I've just tried to shift that work. Like morning is when I try to like close a bunch of tabs. I even got a tab counter thing. Right now on this laptop, I've got, let's see, 150 open. So that's
Oh,
I've
goodness.
by the way, I peaked when I started counting them at like I have two laptops, so I had like almost 500 per laptop. I was like, my life is a mess. I need to get this down. And I realized I was trying to do it at the wrong time of day. So I think there is something to that. And I also wonder like if you're consuming things and getting more context, more is better. But there's a generative part of work that I do feel more energy kind of in the morning or when I first get up than I do when I'm tired, however you define that.
Yeah,
But the partial work, partial day thing was just that, um, again, because we don't track hours, um, I
same,
think
right.
for almost anything, maybe support roles, there's schedules, but um, but we say like, hey, if you want to move to like an 80% expectations, so you're doing about 80% of what someone working full time is doing, you can do that for 80% pay, and you can move between them, you know, not every day, but like weekly essentially or something like so that way some people might want to work a little less and make a little less during the summer and that's a real freeing thing to them. And it's also really nice because they know that at any point they can turn it back up.
Right.
It could be 100% and they're not going to lose their job or anything like that. So that was something we introduced in COVID, particularly when people had a lot of like home care or schooling or something like that, and we've kept it. It's not used a ton, but people also appreciate knowing it's there. And I have seen people also use it. uh, We also have an unlimited AFK, so it's like, how does that interact with the like? But it's more about expectations of accomplishments. So we have an unlimited AFK, and we kind of have expect what someone working full time produces in a given week, month, quarter, year.
Yeah.
Um, so those are uh, those are all kind of complex interplays between those
Hmm.
programs.
And one of the other questions around performance management that we've been struggling with, and I know our companies share a lot of similar philosophies, so I'm curious where you ended up on this. We on the concept of transparency for performance management, um, there are we ultimately landed for compensation that compensation data is confidential and it's not shared. I think Buffer is one company where everyone's compensation data is public. I think there's actually a public spreadsheet and you can see it. Um, but even some of the most transparent companies like Bridgewater, compensation data is confidential. And
Yeah,
so,
we're the same. Compensation is confidential.
you know, Um, performance is another one of those uh, uh, concepts that's on a spectrum of transparency. And
Um,
at Bridgewater, they have baseball cards, and like where you stand and where everyone else stands, and what everyone's strengths and weaknesses are. You know who the underperformers are. It's like visible to everyone at the organization. Um, and at most other companies, it is confidential. Like how you're performing is confidential. And so between basically you and your manager. So I'm curious where you ended up on this concept of performance and how you got there.
um, hmm. We have some areas of work where the feedback loops are public. So support's a great example.
Hmm.
Everyone can see everyone else's how many interactions they had and the ratings of those interactions. Um, that's maybe the thing in our company that's closest to like sports, and that
Sure.
the on the field and off the field contributes to on the field, and the on the field I think is pretty representative of our goals, which is like a great customer experience. So it's not perfect because sometimes people give us low ratings because they're unhappy with the product, not the support. But we we know that. um,
Right.
Almost everywhere else, though, it's so fuzzy. And I think that's why a lot of companies don't have an equivalent of a Bridgewater or like a baseball card, because um, the high performance is a culmination of 1,000 interactions that you have with your colleagues, with external partners, with everyone else. I'll tell you the things that are most on my mind for performance management right now. Um, One is we hired a lot last year, 700 people last year. Took us to
Wow.
about 2,000. Like many companies, we're facing some headwinds, and we don't want to do layoffs. We invested a lot in hiring folks, and so we've explicitly said that. But we're not trying to grow a lot this year. We want to
Hmm.
maintain. Our revenue per employee is a bit low um, compared to others, and also, everyone who works at the company would love to make more. Like, who doesn't want to make more? But
Right.
like fundamentally, that is limited by our revenue per employee. So I think it's both good for the company and good for all the employees if we can kind of increase our revenue per person and our output. And of course, that's breaks down per role and other things. So part of what we're doing as well is saying that if you let someone go for performance, that replacement hire can happen maybe even when the performance improvement plan or PIP starts, not even at the when the person is let go. I've been working a lot to I found some areas where we've had a lot of feedback inflation.
What does that
So
mean?
where someone had like really good peer feedback, and then I was speaking to um, a leader, and they were like, "This person is not even showing up for work. Like it's some baseline things were not being met." And I was like, "Huh." And so then I went to HR. I was like, "It sounds like we should move faster to offer this person a severance." And their response to me was, "But wait, we just gave them a raise based
Wow,
on the feedback." And I was like, "Wow, the company has utterly failed at this."
interesting.
Because
Yeah,
what mixed signals? By the way, it's not fair to that person at all.
for sure.
Um, and so just at every level, there was a failure there. So we have to go and look at the positive feedback they were getting. When was it? Was there some inflation there? What are the incentives? Are people like just giving everyone positive feedback because there's no skin off their back if they do?
Right.
So how does it reflect back on them, their performance if they gave positive feedback to someone who wasn't actually doing that well?
Yeah.
Uh, so you kind of have to work your way through the whole web of interactions there. And that's something we're doing. And the final thing that's on my mind a lot is areas where the entire team is rated as doing well, but we're not meeting our business objectives. So how can we have a high performing individuals on a low performing team?
Right.
Theoretically possible, but especially over the long term, you have to at some point redefine performance for accomplishing those goals. Like it's great that everyone's working
Right.
hard, communicating great, like a model colleague in so many ways. But if we're not working on the right things, we should, take a step back and readdress. And part of what we're doing there is in some places in the company, again, we're 2,000 people, we're pretty big. We're taking entire teams and just saying, let's work on something else. And then that allows us to see like, were we just working on the wrong thing, which is actually what I think it was, or we worked on a problem the wrong way. Maybe we got too stuck in like a certain path.
Sure.
And so let's work on something just totally different and see how this group of people who already know each other really well, who are already really well aligned, who like they're very talented, um, can apply themselves to a brand new problem. And it kind of sucks because like your identity's like attached to this thing you've been working on. But I hope that it also reveals where the problem is, or if there's some other hidden performance issues on the team.
Yeah, it ties into um yeah, that's a really those are some interesting things for us to think about. Those are I can see how we could run into those at some point in the near future. Um on the transparency side, let's say you say have a team that seems to be doing well, but they're not hitting their goals. How I'm reminded of a podcast that I had with Mark Randolph from Netflix, and he says that he had this line that's really stuck with me, which is that people notice what you tolerate,
Mm,
and
yeah.
if you tolerate poor performance, oftentimes many people on the team know this before you do, and it's really demoralizing when you're working really hard, but the people around you are not performing, and it's not a super strong motivator to perform yourself when you notice that the company tolerates people who don't really show up. And um, where I've struggled with this is that the one version of the culture is you hold these people up as examples and you shame them and when you fire them, and that seems like a very bad way to go about it. But the alternative is these people just sort of leave, and nobody nobody knows what the
Yeah.
performance expectation is, and so I don't see a good solution here on how you handle that.
I don't know a good solution either. Um,
Okay.
Typically, do not publicly comment when someone's let go for performance. In fact, we allow people to do their own goodbye post and things, and yeah, and that's just kind of like respect and dignity. I think is important on the way in and out for folks. Um, Hopefully, the ones on their team realize that the immediate team And your
Yeah.
whole company is probably small enough that maybe that's most of the company will realize. But you don't have to be mean about it or public about it. We occasionally will post to the whole company about something. Um, Usually without, we're doing it right now. We just did one a few days ago. We let someone go because of expenses. Just a, so to me, when it's an opportunity to both just really restate that that's not okay. This person had actually doctored some expense things, which to me is like very clearly like almost fraud or malfeasance. So
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
that's a no-brainer. Um, and also reaffirm our culture of trust. Like we're not changing our policies because of this, but we're going to remind everyone this isn't okay. And um, it's a trust and verify.
For
This is
sure.
how this is what happened. We, finance raised that this was unusual. HR looked into it, and then we let this person go immediately, just so folks know that like um, as well, because we have had it before. The same thing you said with performance. If you see someone ordering something really, really expensive at dinner, and you're like, "Oh, I'm gonna get the burger," and they're getting, the porterhouse or like a $200 meal or something on the company dime, like that also can be corrosive for trying to save the company money.
Hmm.
And so I think those things are important. Also, things that everyone in the company can set an example of, particularly managers.
Yeah.
If we're ever at a restaurant, I'm very conscious of what I order, the price of what I order. I don't even know if anyone knows this, but I think they do.
Yeah.
Um, and if we're going to celebrate something or like entertain a client or something, let's be very explicit about that.
Right.
Like, hey, this client is paying us $4 million a year. We're going to take them out and we're going to order the nicest wine on the menu for them. Like,
Hmm.
and we're going to say that beforehand. It's not going to be an on the fly thing or something. We're all going to know this is going to happen and we're all going to really enjoy that
Right.
as like a celebration. So those are important too, but just like, you know, casually or on the fly, not premeditated, I think that can send the wrong message.
Yeah. For sure.
We're very, very frugal on expenses, and it's so hard to maintain that frugality as you grow. And I actually really appreciate this kind of like economic turbulence is kind of the third we've been through in the history of our company. And every time we've gone through it, it's made our company so much better.
Hmm.
As much as I can say, hey, we need to be efficient, we need to be frugal, we need to be all these things. When you're hiring 700 people in a year,
Yeah.
you definitely you pick up some extra um, in terms of processes and efficiency and everything like that, and perhaps tolerating some low performance in areas you just aren't noticing or didn't pay attention to. So times like this are really, really good to just loop back. And it's something I'm doing with all of our teams now is just going through kind of every project and saying like, hey, is this contributing to growth or revenue? Sorry, yeah, engagement or revenue, or is this like paying down technical debt or maintenance and something we need to do continuously? If it doesn't fall into one of those three buckets, and we should have a certain proportion of each, um, let's re-examine it.
Right. Yeah. We've hired 30 people in the last year, and that's been its own set of struggles. I can't imagine 700. um, one of the
It's a lot.
Yeah, it is. Um, one of the other questions, uh, this is something that we have hired relatively senior to date, I think much more so than is typical for a company at our stage. And so things like mentorship and personal growth has not been as much of a priority. But as we've continued to get bigger and hired more people who are maybe earlier on in their careers, we're starting to notice that basically we can't assume that everybody is a self-driven autodidact anymore,
Mm,
and we're struggling to figure out mentorship. Just tactically seems a lot easier in a co-located team. You're physically next to the person, they can shadow you, but not even want to say more junior people, but it's like people who are not very senior in their careers
mm,
need some guidance and mentorship, and we haven't really been able to do that. And I don't think we've had a good process for that. So I'm curious if that's something you've thought about and how you achieved it.
We've tried to break that up into a few different things. So we have a coaching program, so people can get reimbursed for coaching. We actually, at this point, have like, I think 30 coaches that are kind of like pre-approved. We have a
Hmm,
contract with them, et cetera, et cetera. So if you want to get coaching, like you sign up, you need to do this like month-long course, essentially. That's a self-starter thing. And then once you complete that, you can interview a couple of coaches, pick your favorite one, and that's all reimbursed. It's very expensive. Like these coaches are typically a couple $100s per hour, but I think it's one of the best investments we make because they're all familiar with Automatic because they work
right,
with other
right.
people. So they kind of know our weirdness and our quirks and everything versus a one-off. I think there's an advantage to a coach working with several people in a company, and they're totally outside of the management structure. So these folks are just for you. They don't determine your performance. They don't give feedback on your compensation. They're just like, so I think it's even better than a manager. And if they're good, hopefully they're good. We do two-way ratings on them, and we try to get rid of the coaches that get low ratings or show up late to meetings or something like that. Um, they're going to push you, and you can bring your problems to them, and they'll like any good coach. By the way, every great performer you see in the world works with coaches.
Right.
LeBron James has like 8 coaches. He's like a coach for everything. Not literally like a pinky toe coach, but I'm sure some equivalent where there's like something maybe like a fast twitch coach or something,
Yeah.
you know? That's awesome. And then on the other side of that, I find meetups really important. So getting people together in person, especially now that that's much more possible than ever, is a worthwhile investment. And even as, you know, our e-commerce business, we saw e-commerce payments slow down a lot this year. I think just as stuff started to shift from online to offline,
Yeah.
and maybe broader macroeconomic trends. So that was like I think that's coming in like $30 million of revenue below plan. So of course we looked at all of our budgets. And the one thing that we were like, we're not going to touch is our meetup budget. One, because by the way, we saved a ton of money during COVID by not doing it. We were about 10 million a
Mm,
year pre-COVID. And two, I just feel, especially in a situation where perhaps half the company has not been to a meetup before, especially at the start of the year, it's just a really great investment for people to get together. And it's also okay for this to be informal. It could just be two people getting together for a couple days. It could be just a co-working situation. You can definitely do it virtually with like some screen sharing and everything. And you should do that too, especially for new people who might not be able to travel. But to the extent you're able to get people together in person a few times a year, it is invaluable.